Education is something that is talked about at COP27. I'm sat at the moment in the blue zone, in the pavilions, amongst the pavilions, and it's a word that appears on a lot of the panel titles. It's an issue that is framing a lot of the side events, but it's not always clear where education fits as part of the negotiations and the broader, deeper processes at COP27 and COPs in general. Before coming to Egypt, I spent a bit of time just trying to understand a bit more about that, to look where education featured and to see how it featured as well. And it led me to a study, one that was conducted in 2019 by Education International, who were examining countries' NDCs. So the NDCs are the nationally determined contributions, which are a country's national plan for action on reducing greenhouse gases and adapting to the impacts of climate change. And when they looked at the NDCs, they analysed each of them using a climate education report card. Now, this was something that they devised as a way of just trying to see who was making the grade on climate change education. So it was part of the study was to devise this report card and then apply that across the NDCs. And when they did that, the results were quite stark. So only 42 of the 160 NDCs that came forward and that they considered had mentioned the education of children and youth. And of that, none of them formally recognised the role of girls' education in the strategies, despite the fact that girls are some of the most affected population by the climate crisis. The same analysis was conducted ahead of COP27, and there hasn't been much change really. And that is despite the fact that countries at COP26 were really being called upon to include educational strategies within their NDCs. There was a strong push on youth activism and demands for climate justice education and climate change education throughout curriculums, but it looks as though that has not been taken up in terms of the educational strategies of the NDCs that have been submitted this year. And despite the fact that if you actually look as a comparison between 2019, so COP25, and the first study was conducted, and then again here at COP27, you would see that 3/4 of the countries that have submitted their NDCs actually have included education or have mentioned education. So that's up 68% from 2019. So it looks as though there is inclusion. But when we start to look at the detail, you see that education is referred to in general terms. So education isn't necessarily the sole purpose, but it's included. Education is included as a support act to the main aim. So it's about supporting countries to reach their targets, but it's not education for its own good, for its own purpose necessarily. So when you look beyond that use of education, what you can see is that only 1/4 of NDCs specifically mention the education of children and youth as an issue in its own right, which is actually down about 26% from the 2019 analysis. And only about 1/5 of the NDCs actually mention climate change education, and none of the NDCs are calling for compulsory climate change education as a climate strategy as well. So really it feels as though the demands for climate education are not turning from sort of the activist voice that came forward and the need for implementation that came forward at COP26, actually seeing that turn into action, actually seeing that translate into clear strategies as to how they might achieve this. And I think that's quite interesting. And I say this because when I'm sat here in the blue zone, what I can see is a real push on green futures, green career opportunities within renewables and so on. So you would think that educational pathways into those industries might be aligned with climate change education. And I believe that's really important as a point to consider, because to achieve the targets that are being set, the NDCs that are being set, then what we have to do, I feel, is take a more holistic view that this is not just about, say, for example, technological shifts or knowledge held within certain sectors or industry, learning how to do a green job. This is about fundamental behaviour shifts and shifts in social and educational systems and structures too. So just to finish up, 3 key recommendations really came forward from the report, and they're things that I'm going to consider over the next few days whilst I'm here at COP27. And these three things are, first is about the prioritising of quality climate change education that really centres climate justice. So not as a nice to have, as an add-on, but as a core component of quality education. Because I think that when we truly understand climate change as a complex issue that is involving technological, social, financial, and political aspects, then it becomes clear that education, in terms of helping to understand what's needed and why it's needed, becomes the fundamental aspect of collectively moving towards the climate targets. The second thing I'll be looking for and paying attention to, and that came out in the report as well, is that there needs to be an involvement of educational professionals and involving educational professionals, education unions in the NDC processes, to see them as key stakeholders, to prioritise professional learning, to support those within education with the pedagogical tools, some support to help to guide their learners, and to actually see that this is a learning process for everyone involved in education as well, not really a differentiation between teaching and teachers and learners, really. And the final thing is about strengthening education systems, that all of the best plans that we may intend to make, they're going to fall short if education systems are underfunded, if they're under-resourced, if teachers feel undervalued, overburdened. So this is really about trying to look for an integration between the climate policy makers and education ministers to really develop plans for mitigation, adaptation, so that education is core to that, core to national efforts and core to national strategies as well, and not just referred to in those kind of general terms that I outlined at the start. So I'm looking forward to following these themes and to see what emerges over the next few days.